So this is our question and answer session for this week. Some good questions. Thank you very much. So let's get right started. Why was there a lack of focus in the U.S. on Asian politics? It seemed to be busy with Latin America. Indeed, they were in Europe, but it seemed a complete lack of interest. Yes and no. I mean, I think that the issue here is that the diplomatic situation in Asia was much more complicated than in either Europe or Latin America. So here's a map of Asia as of mid 1920. So we have China here, but China sort of in a dismembered state. Tibet is kind of an autonomous region at this point in China. All of these areas here that are kind of in the slanted lines. These were parts of China that are called spheres of influence. Basically, outside powers more or less ran them. The Japanese were in control de facto of Manchuria, of Korea, also of Taiwan. U.S. had a colony in the Philippines. The French had a colony in modern-day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Modern-day Myanmar was under the control of the British, as for Malaysia, and Indonesia was under the control of the Dutch. So you have a lot of these foreign powers that are active in the region. And in the 20s, East Asia is really governed by three separate treaties: the 4, 5, and 9 power treaties. So the 4 power treaty is between Japan, the U.S., Great Britain, and France, and they agree that just on East Asia, no other part of the world, that they would informally consult before any of them took a unilateral action in the region to deal with a threat to the peace. 5 power treaty was the 4 of them plus Italy, and that was the disarmament treaty that I mentioned in the snippets. And then there was a 9 power treaty that called for a degree of internationalism and common action vis-a-vis China. China in the 1920s, as you know, East Asian history is under the control of the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party. The communists are emerging as a left-wing challenger in Chinese history in the 30s and 40s. Will it be in part trying to resist Japanese expansion, but in part this internal battle between the communists and the nationalists? So basically, in this kind of environment, the U.S. freedom of action is much more limited because the Asian strategic situation has lots of different actors, and the U.S. is willing to go along with the remainder as long as they're sort of getting their interests accommodated. One other area in the 20s where the U.S. is active, there's cooperation here in Southeast Asia, especially modern day Vietnam and the Philippines, between the U.S., the French, the Dutch, and the British over an international drug trade, sort of the equivalent of the modern day trade in heroin and cocaine. Southeast Asia is a big place for illegal drugs, and the drug runners would often move between the various colonies: Indonesia under the Dutch, Vietnam under the French, Philippines under the U.S., the Hong Kong area under the British, and so that forced another degree of cooperation. So in effect, East Asia in the 20s in particular, there's more cooperation formal cooperation among the great powers than in any other region in the world. And so the US is acting more internationally rather than nationally in the region. Another question on the League and East Asia: did the League of Nations abandonment of China during the Manchurian incident squander the goodwill of Article 10 or the League of Nations reputation as a whole for other nations? Basically, yes, as we're talking about it in the snippets. And then, did Japan have any immediate repercussions from leaving the League of Nations? And the answer to that is no. The League responds to the Manchurian Accords by having a study commission to figure out that Japan invaded China. I mean, you could have figured that out in around 2 seconds. The commission takes around 6 months. It's called the Lytton Commission. It's headed by a nobleman from Great Britain, the Earl of Lytton. They produced a report saying no surprise, Japan initiated the conflict with the Chinese. When that report is issued, Japan formally withdraws from the League, but they face no repercussions for doing so. I mean, keep in mind what's going on in world affairs at this point. 1933 is basically the very, very low point of the Depression. Hitler is just coming to power in Germany. Mussolini is kind of rattling sabers with regards to East Asia. Hoover is being replaced by FDR in the U.S., and so Japan at the end of the day basically gets away with it, and they do pull out of the League, so they lose the cooperation that comes with the League. But other than that, they face no repercussions at all. What was the point of the Little Entente? Did the participating countries accomplish anything from it, or did it serve uselessly, seeing that World War II did actually happen? This is a really interesting question. So the Little Entente, remember, consisted of a military alliance between these three countries in East Central Europe. Newly created Czechoslovakia, newly created Yugoslavia, and expanded Romania. They aligned among themselves, and they also had a joint military alliance with France. You can see from this map that the Little Entente basically surrounds, or almost surrounds, one country, Hungary, and each of these countries had assumed a bit of Hungarian territory, Romania most of all, but the southern portion of Slovakia, the Hungarians had claimed that in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Hungary had also ruled the northern section of sort of Serbia here, the area that I'm circling, which is called Vojvodina. And so that was the common interest for the Little Entente members, that they wanted to prevent a resurgent Hungary that would be able to seize back their territories. And by and large, they succeeded through the 20s and into the 1930s. And all of these countries were also very active in the League of Nations. They sensed correctly that as long as the post-war liberal internationalist order remained in place, that their position as basically winners from World War I would be satisfied. Now, these countries are very, very different internally. Czechoslovakia was a functioning multi-party parliamentary democracy. Yugoslavia was an increasingly authoritarian monarchy, Serb monarchy, so there was real repression for the Croats, for the Slovenes, for the Bosnians. And Romania was a monarchy, but with some degree of political openness. But all of them were pro-Western during the 1920s. And the question asks, given that World War II actually happened, did they accomplish anything? It's sort of one of the areas. I mean, I'll be talking about a little bit in the snippets for this week, the missed opportunities. If World War II had begun with the Little Entente as a full alliance with France, the war might have ended a lot more quickly. But as it was, by the time of the start of World War I, Czechoslovakia has been dismembered. Romania has had an internal coup and is veering towards the Nazis. And Yugoslavia, the leadership is very divided. The royal family is very divided between a kind of neutralist approach tilting towards the Nazis and a neutralist approach tilting towards the British. So by the time the start of World War II, the Little Entente no longer exists. And then a kind of general question, but one I think that sort of gets at the area. FDR and his ability to hide the effects of polio. How come no one questioned when he was being helped up by his sons, powerful braces? Did nobody point out his disabilities? It's a really, really interesting question. There are very, very few photographs of FDR in his wheelchair that survives. This one that I have here on the screen, it's a rare one. He's with the granddaughter of the sort of main custodian of his home in Hyde Park, New York. But there are only a handful of these photos. When the FDR Memorial, was established around a decade and a half or so ago in D.C., there was this robust debate about whether or not disability advocates often said, look, he should be put shown in his wheelchair, presented in his wheelchair in the memorial, because after all, he was disabled. But there is a conscious effort to conceal that disability from the public, and this is one area where the contemporary media is it's very, very different from the media during this time. Everyone in the political press in Washington, D.C. understood that FDR was disabled, that he was unable to walk, that he was in a wheelchair. But this was not reported. The sense was that it was not the job of the press to report items about a politician's personal life that the politician would prefer to conceal from the public. FDR had also had an affair in the 1920s with a woman named Lucy Rutherford. That too is widely known, but it's not reported. So in effect, we have a kind of different political tradition. Now, why did FDR not want this reported? This is certainly a different era with regards to disability than physical disability, at least than today. In the 1920s, the sense is that if the public knew that FDR were physically disabled, that they would never conceivably elect him president. And I think that consensus was correct. I mean, contrast that to today. The governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, it's the second biggest state in the country, is disabled. He can't walk. He's in a wheelchair, and he's perfectly open about that. He appeared in campaign ads with his, sitting in his wheelchair. But that's not the custom that FDR takes. And we do live in an era where there often is a sense, that the president doesn't have any personal life and the press is too intrusive. But this is really one of the reasons why this sense that in earlier portions of American history, the press was too deferential and allowed policymakers to conceal things that that the public really ought to have known. So that's it for the Q&A for this week. Hope everyone is well, and I'll see people back in the discussion sections.